Suzanne, what do I need to do now?
Audio check.
Christine's
Audio check.
bio. When it was she was so bad. That was like, we have another, they had full exam and everybody could be. I remember that. That's a solution. Older. I'm like, I didn't, we have another school. I mean, it was. Yeah, it's a pretty big figure it out. Like some out again. Forget to take your time. That's all. It's like that's what it is. Yeah, but that's like it's like for any tips. Yeah. Yeah, everyone else can now. Maybe they're. No, she's writing. So at the end, I felt that way, like that. It's on the basis of. Like they're getting ready. So pretty. I just lived it. Yeah, that's fine. There's so much. I was like, oh, with it. She's leaving us right. Just because I was like, she like been to me. Do you see your skills? I just saw that. Yeah, I mean, if it doesn't. Yeah, no, there's yeah, my she needs right anyway, you all are. Yes, thank you.
Hello. Wonderful to see so many folks. Welcome. There's several seats up front too. Don't be shy.
Okay, hello everybody. Great to see all these everybody come today. My name is Dr. Christine Knott, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And we're welcoming you all to the second speaker series in the Bread and Roses Feminist Futures for Earth and its Waters, Lands, and Skies, which is a colloquium series for the Women's Studies Department. So this second lecture is the Bonnie Zimmerman Lesbian Studies lecture. And I'm gonna start us off with the land acknowledgement. We stand upon a land that carries the footsteps of millennia of Kumeyaay people. They are a people whose traditional lifeways intertwine with a worldview of earth and sky and a community of living beings. This land is part of a relationship that has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced the Kumeyaay people to the present day. It is part of a worldview founded in the harmony of the cycles of the sky and balance in the forces of life. For the Kumeyaay, red and black represent the balance of those forces that provide for the harmony within our bodies as well as the world around us. As students, faculty, staff, and alumni of San Diego State University, we acknowledge the legacy of the Kumeyaay. We promote this balance in life as we pursue our goals of knowledge and understanding. We find inspiration in the Kumeyaay spirit to open our minds and hearts. It is the legacy of the red and black. It is the land of the Kumeyaay. My heart is good. So we're really honored that Dr. Bonnie Zimmerman, who endowed this lecture, is joining us today. I'm just gonna say a few words about Bonnie. So Bonnie Zimmerman started teaching in the Department of Women's Studies in 1978 and became professor of women's studies in 1983. She was president of the National Women's Studies Association from 1998 to 1999 and served as the Women's Studies Department Chair at FTSU from 1986 to 1992 and again from 1995 to 1997. She also served as SDSU's Associate Vice President for Faculty Affairs before retiring in 2010. Zimmerman said, "No matter how the social and academic landscape changes, and no matter that I am now a university administrator, I will always be a child of the 60s and 70s, a new left, radical feminist, counterculture, dyke intellectual." Some of the awards received by Zimmerman include the Lambda Literary Award for Nonfiction in 1990, the Positive Visibility Award from GLAAD in 1996, the Most Influential Faculty Award in Women's Studies, which she received 4 times, and the Alumni Association Distinguished Faculty Award in 2004. And you can find the Bonnie Zimmerman papers here in the library at SDSU in the Special Collections and University Archives. So, just welcome Bonnie.
Thank you, everyone. There are folks coming in. It brings so much joy to our hearts. Lots of folks. There's some seating up front.
At the front, and
Yes.
you over there.
Yeah, please join us. In addition to Dr. Bonnie Zimmerman, we want to thank the College of Arts and Letters LGBTQ Studies program, the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies, as well as the Environmental Humanities Lab, and of course our department, the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And I have the great honor of introducing now our guest speaker, and I should introduce myself first. I am Professor Irene Lara, and I am here part of the faculty and co-organizing with my colleague Christine the Feminist Colloquium this year. Our guest is here, Susy. Welcome. Susy Zepeda, she, her, ella, they, PhD, is a queer Chicana Indígena associate professor in the Chicana Studies Department at the University of California, Davis, Patwin, homeland, and formerly a fifth grade teacher for LA Unified. I still have to ask you about that trajectory. That's amazing. Susy received her PhD from UC Santa Cruz in sociology with a designated emphasis in feminist studies and Latin American and Latino studies, and her BA from CSU Long Beach in sociology and women's studies. She currently serves on the executive committee of the Cultural Studies Graduate Group at UC Davis. And I've shared with you several of our MA students have actually gone on to that program, that doctoral program. Her work is intentionally transdisciplinary, decolonial, and feminist in a community-centered and grounded way. Susy's research and teaching focus on spirit work, decolonization, critical feminist of color, collaborative methodologies, oral and visual storytelling, and intergenerational healing. Susy is a student and practitioner rooted in remembering and honoring traditional indigenous medicine of this hemisphere, and most specifically Mesoamerica. She established 2 courses in the Chicana Studies Department at UC Davis, Decolonizing Spirit and Food Justice. Susy's writing appears in the anthologies Voices from the Ancestors, Chicanx and Latinx Spiritual Expressions and Healing Practices, Mujeres de Maíz en Movimiento, Spiritual Artivism, Healing Justice and Feminist Praxis, and A Love Letter to This Bridge Called My Back. As part of a writing collaborative, the Santa Cruz Feminist of Color Collective, and inspired by Audre Lorde's classic essay and mentor, Angela Davis, they published the article, Building, unquote, the Edge of Each Other's Battles, end quote, a feminist of color multi-dimensional lens, in Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy. In 2019, she co-curated the Chicanx Futurity art exhibition at the Shrem Museum, and Cosmic Matriarchs, exhibited at Taller Arte del Nuevo Amanecer. More recently, she collaborated with Maria Figueroa to co-curate Indigenous Borderlands, Weaving Napantla, Remembering Sacred Relations at Centro Cultural de la Raza. Susy's first book is titled Queering Mesoamerican Diasporas, Remembering Chicana Indígena Ancestry, with a foreword written by Ana Louise Keating, published by the University of Illinois Press in 2022 as part of the Transformations, Womanist, Feminist, and Indigenous Studies book series. In 2023, Susy wrote an essay for Feminist Formations titled Chicana, Chicanx, Indígena Futures, Rerouting Through Traditional Medicines. Also in 2023, Zepeda, led by Dr. Amra Solomon, along with other UC professors, were awarded the UCHRI Multi-Campus Faculty Working Group Grant with a focus on Indigenous borderlands, refusal, and fugitivity. Susy is currently completing a podcast project in collaboration with Dr. Laura Perez and undergraduate students, Dr. Perez from UC Berkeley and undergraduate students at UC Davis, titled Lab plus Art plus Audio, Laboratorio, Art as Research. Susy serves on the board of the National Compadres Network and Metzli Ishel Tonawali, MIT. She's also an advisor to the National Comadres Network and co-facilitates a LGBTQ2S+ Healing Heart Círculo. And I love your whole bio, but this is one of my favorite lines, your last line. She loves Madre Tierra, is a tia to her nephew Nova, and has a cosmic dog named Goyo Yolotzi. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest lecturer.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, and I'm glad that we took the time to recognize Bonnie Zimmerman. Such an honor to be here in your presence and all of you here. I'm also really grateful for that beautiful land acknowledgement, and I was wondering why I was wearing red and yellow. It's not the colors I usually wear, but I do believe in, everything coming together exactly the way it needs to be. This is not in my script, so I'm gonna attempt it, but I'm called to just offer just a little good morning. Buenos días, buenos días, buenos días, hey ana hene. La sokamati, hey ana hene. La sokamati, hey ana hene. Qualitanesi, buenos días, good morning. Thank you all for being here and for being part of this lecture today. So my name is Susy Zepeda. My mother's name is Adela Zepeda, and there are still seats. So maybe if you can raise your hand for those who are looking for seats. My mother's name is Adela Zepeda. My father's name is Armando Zepeda. My mom is from El Limon, Jalisco, and my dad is from Chinipas, Chihuahua. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so just let me know if you can't hear me for some reason. I'm usually pretty loud, but just making sure. So I really see myself as a queer Chicana and Indígena, a writer, a profesora, and a student, right? And always sort of this lifelong learning. And that's part of my journey. And really understanding, particularly traditional medicine of this hemisphere, and more specifically of Mesoamerica. And so we already received a beautiful land acknowledgement, but I'm just gonna go ahead and thank the Kumeyaay peoples and all original peoples for stewarding their lands, for creating these spaces for us, for letting us be here in a good way. And I encourage us, as we're sort of starting this time, to find your feet on the floor if possible. You can even kind of lower your gaze and just go ahead and take that collective breath together, right? And in this moment, as we're breathing in and exhaling, we're breathing in and exhaling through our nose, just remembering that we can sort of leave our worries and anything else at the door and just allow ourselves to be here for this next hour or so, to surrender to this time. I thank you all for being here, for giving your time, and just want to honor the four directions, the east, the west, the north, and the south, as well as the cosmos and Madre Tierra. And lots of gratitude for being here. I particularly want to thank Profesora Irene Lara in Women's Studies, all the organizers there. Thank you for everyone from the department for being here, all the sponsoring units, Chicano Studies, LGBTQ+ Studies, and Environmental Humanities Lab, as well as all the staff, the students, all the organizers who put so much into creating these spaces for us. And I know that this is, along with being a Bonnie Zimmerman lecture, I know that it's also part of a Bread and Roses Feminist Research Colloquium. And I love this, envisioning and engaging feminist futures for Earth and its waters, lands, and skies. And for me, that's very significant, right? Because that's really connected to what I feel like I'm doing in my work and in my research. My work is really rooted in decolonization. And I tend to go off script, but I'm going to try my best to stay on because of time. But when I was a graduate student and approaching the time of sort of choosing the topic for my qualifying exams, I expressed to my four professors that I really wanted to focus on decolonization. And they kind of looked at me, that was in 2007, and they kind of looked at me and said, "You're not going anywhere with them. Like, you have to let that go." And, maybe they're gonna see this, they already know. And exactly. And I said to myself, it was like this internal kind of feeling like I had to follow what I felt. And I said, okay, that's okay. I'm gonna, do my best, get through these exams, and I'm gonna trust myself. And since then, I have felt this call to understand what decolonization means, particularly for Chicanx people that have been detribalized or have been cut off from remembering our ancestral roots. And so since then, I have really done this work in my research and in my studies to really reckon with what it means to be de-indigenized across the hemisphere and to do the work of re-indigenization. This has become a central guide for myself, healing from susto, right? That fright of being disconnected that I carry myself, who I felt I was seemingly cut off from my indigenous ancestors in the land. And that healing really started to enter and come when I started to witness writers and artists and elders and filmmakers, different types of artists in their ceremony and through their creations, that I started to see in their creations and myself also sort of surrendering to participating in my own ceremony that sometimes was within my inner world and sometimes was with community, that really opened up a pathway, right? And gave me permission and access to imagine and tune into my own voice, as well as my own traumas. And then that work of starting to heal my lineages, and most importantly, bring the healing to my own body, mind, spirit, to borrow from flesh and the spirit. So this is how I really came to write this book, Queering Mesoamerican Ancestries. And I shared this altar that was created and raised by my good friend, Pablo Alvarez, who's also a scholar, professor at Cal State Fullerton. And this was when we received the book in print. And when I arrived to his house, he had this happening. And these are some prayer cards that Gilda Posada created and a little prayer that I wrote right when the pandemic started. We really wanted to circulate prayer cards the way that our families would. And of course, my name and her name doesn't appear on it because that's not the point. It was more about getting out a message and sharing with folks. So I come to this work of writing this book and also presenting to you today from a perspective of a granddaughter whose abuelita, grandmother, was plagued with forgetting, with Alzheimer's. And as I understood it, it was this struggle to survive. And that really was the reason that she sort of went into this place of the forgetting. That's how my spirit really understands it. But from her prayers that manifested in climbing to the tops of the mountains in her hometown to visit La Virgencita, and also her cooking her chiles, making her tortillas, and birthing 9 children in her humble home, as well as nursing my uncle back to health after he got bit by a snake, that all started to give me, those stories started to give me the strength to really remember. Really understanding her cosmic love now from the spirit world reminds me to let go of those legacies of erasure that I have inherited. During her lifetime, the daily braiding of her hair, her long black and gray hair, was a visual prayer for me that really ignited my daily existence and my Indígena memory. Through the beautification, I witnessed her love for her whole self, even though you could tell it was hard for her to love herself. In that moment of braiding her hair, I could feel it was emanating, that she really did have a genuine love and respect for herself. I now live with a mom who has dementia, and my whole heart wishes that she could have faced her traumas or had a different pathway so she could have retained her memory. But I know her spirit remembers joy. I feel it in her frijoles, in her cooking, her salsa, and also in her laughter. I do my best to laugh with her and hug her whenever I can, to be a rebozo, that little blanket for her being. So really, this is how I arrived to my writing, that memory and remembering are central to understanding quiénes somos, who we are. Yet the colonial logics of violence cause deep seeds of forgetting, misremembering, doubt, anxiety, shame. I think most of us can relate to that or connect with that in some way. So it became a challenge to believe myself, oneself, to find a path towards healing and trust in the medicine of the plants and the earth have to offer us. So my writing actually became a way to find a root and trust my intuition, my emotional intelligence. I had a strong desire to find language for being queer, Chicana, and Indígena. I saw this reflected in artwork, archives, writing, altars, and stories of Latina lesbians and queer Indígena artists and Chicana writers. The storytelling and visual memory really offered me a weaving of my existence and simultaneously gave me tools to seek transformation for injustices in our world. So what I'm going to share with you today in this talk, I'm going to build with 2 chapters and at least open them up, right? And the title of my talk is Opening Intergenerational Pathways to Queerness. And really, I'm basing it on these two chapters, Queer Indígena Art, as well as Tracing Latina Lesbian Histories of Resistance, Solidarity, and Visibility. And what I'm trying to do is just open up a dialogue with you all to see what catches your attention, what speaks to you, what reflects something that you would like to be in dialogue with all of us today about. So my research, again, was really ignited from this desire to understand historical formations of lesbians of color, and in particularly the genealogies of Chicana and Latina lesbianas. As a young Chicana dyke, which is how I named myself when I first came out, I felt so connected to that word. And as a researcher, emerging scholar who was involved with student and community activism at Cal State Long Beach and beyond, I was curious to find my reflection in social movements of the 60s and 70s. There had to be Latina lesbianas who were advocating for people's rights. And I just couldn't quite find them or locate them. And I was in search for complex identities formation. How was somebody who was a lesbian or queer also exist as a Chicana or woman of color during this movement? It was sort of this basic question and searching in the archives to try to find that. So in my larger work, I trace and remember hidden histories and silences of queer Mesoamerican indigenous ancestries and medicinal practices. And in this case of these two chapters, this is where I actually did the work to interview folks, sit with them, and to learn their story. So this is sort of the roots of the book. When I think about my ancestors, I wonder how the queer expressed themselves. The two-spirit, the trans, the girl boys, the he-she's, las otras, las raras. I do not question whether they existed, but wonder how they negotiated their existence. Were their methods similar to our current strategies of survival and identification? Did they pray with their ancestors, past, present, and future? What roles did they play in their communities? What impact did colonization have on their realities? We may never know exact answers, yet the work of tracing makes it possible to piece together expressions of historical memory that have endured or have been reimagined by succeeding generations through cultural production. I navigate tracing as a queer, non-linear historical methodology that allows us to reroute ourselves in the past in order to imagine reflections of ourselves and open possibilities for transformation in our present and future. At the center of this tracing are the voices, narratives, alignments, and energies that are silenced due to disciplinary ruptures. Due to the disciplinary ruptures their existence necessitates. So the methodology of tracing or excavando, digging with a good heart, became this productive way for me to unearth knowledge of historical and ancestral truths, right? Always wanting to do the work in a very careful way of sort of searching, but also being critical of what I was finding. Always this negotiating, this balance of walking in that way. And knowing that there was books that were burned, that these memories literally were intentionally destroyed at times, but that there was pieces, there was fragments that could be built with. Understanding that there was systems that imposed their forms of faith or religion, that there was forms of genocide. And so what I started to notice as I was doing my research is that there was significant interventions by scholars who were in lesbian studies, in feminist studies, Chicana studies, trans and queer of color studies, that started to look at the silences and the erasures as a place to unearth, right? Not as something that was void, but that there was something in those lines. So that became sort of where I rooted myself and started to search. So the tracing and the silences of communities in resistance disrupt colonial forms of epistemic violence and erasure. So the silence then is not connected only to absent discourses, but also to social and political exclusions of marginalized or other peoples and voices. My tracing then became looking at these historical narratives to find what I could find through archival work, through participant observation, and through formal and informal interviews. I did this work primarily between 2009 and 2018 with Chicana X and Diasporic Latina X artists, special archival librarians, and other key social actors in queer and trans people of color communities. So threaded together, these became the counter narratives of where my research started to bloom. And I really focused in on queer Mesoamerican ancestries because I really wanted to understand what was there in terms of the interrelatedness and the hidden parts that get taken away when we sort of use the more modern term, for example, of Latinx, right? I wanted to go to this place where I could question Hispanic. I could even unthink what it means to be Mexican or mestizo, and even lesbian, right? To understand how did this all come together? And really, it's a search, it's a remembering, and it's a digging, right? So that's really how I took my cues to really do the work to unthink what was presented to me as this is what the truth is, right? I wanted to sort of understand maybe ideas or concepts that weren't necessarily in print quite yet. So I really went to Chicana historian Emma Perez's work to really understand how she looked at decolonial imaginary and also at queering the borderlands, and to start to ask questions of dominant narrative and how do we remember the time before nation state borders, territorial ownership, and modes of illegality. How did our ancestors honor the land through everyday practices that together we may recognize as forms of decolonization? I also asked, what does re-indigenization look like in our current historical moment? What does growth in our consciousness or opening doors to conocimiento and transformation as theorized by Anzaldúa look like when we're encountering deeper relations of complicated and contradictory truths? What is the role of ceremony in this remembering? And perhaps one of the key parts there is the contradictory truths, right? Because as soon as you start to find something, you start to see that something else contradicts it or an idea doesn't jive with that one. So how do you start to make sense out of not wanting to write another linear history, right? Or uncomplicated one, but to allow for the complexities. And I think that's what really lesbian studies, feminist studies, women of color studies really gives us a space to do, to walk in contradiction, right? And to see the complications and to not want to flatten things out. So in this landscape of political history of Mesoamerica, colonization, forms of genocide, and the rigid domination of the Spanish crown that outlawed traditional indigenous spirit practices, I wanted to understand the spiritual practices as well. And what I found there was that I really needed to do the work to understand, or at least tap into what ceremony may have been like and what it is like. And I found that that work really was happening with artists, writers, cultural producers who are really doing the work to call their own spirits back, to call our spirits back in the writing of Patricia Gonzalez. In Red Medicine, we see that work. And so I started to find this language and to name it creativity as spirit work, right? Being able to trust oneself enough that they are in ceremony with ancestors to be able to create something that's going to bring a remembering for themselves and for others. And with that, I really want to highlight part of the core of my work is really thinking about and through women of color feminism. And this site really gave me the space to understand that theorizing is sacred, right? And so again, at the time that I was writing, if I would say this out loud, they would be like, okay, you have to leave now, right? This is not what's happening, right? But for me, it's really what I felt, right? Like, this is so sacred, like for some, because it really felt, when I, for example, when I read This Bridge Called My Back, I really felt that you could feel the fire in the words, right? You could feel that there was a longing that they were pointing to, that there was a loss that they were grieving, right? There was a sadness that they were putting on the paper. And for me, that felt like, this is so special for someone to open up their heart and put their writing on the paper so that we could read it and experience it. So I started to see that feminists of color really provided us with a way of thinking through another way of making knowledge, right? And putting logics together to help us articulate our own thoughts and our own healing. And so I started to see that that was a pathway for me to really do the work of remembering, creating spaces of ceremony and reciprocity, and also building respectful relations. So as an intellectual site, it became a site that, again, sometimes can be trivialized, sometimes can be sort of not seen as important, but that really the creativity, the collaboration was the center there that really could then speak back to power structures. And what I noticed is that a lot of feminists and queer political theorists were really drawing from Ansandua to build their own decolonial analysis and methodologies. So I'll go first to the first chapter here of Queer Indígena art. And really what I want to share is that even though the chapters are separate, they really do come together in the sense that what's happening there is marking a genealogy of thought and existence. So for chapter 3 of Queer Indígena art, here I see the visual prayers of queer Indígena artists evoke memories that heal the earth, right? So what I started to witness when I looked at their artwork were possibilities and instructions of how actually to take care of Mother Tierra, right? To actually care for the earth. And this was sort of a profound moment for me of what does it mean to see myself also as a responsible actor in this work, right? So a rerouting and a walking in balance with the earth is vital and it is key to remembering for culture producers that are centered here. Remembering through oral and visual storytelling is particularly important in the historical context of Chicana X and Latinx communities who have, to different degrees, been displaced, detribalized, and de-indigenized across the hemisphere. So the featured artists that I evoke, the featured artists that I focus on evoke spirit and healing as they create, and they visualize and interconnect the past, present, and future through narrative representations. So I see them as the historians of the contemporary world and the storytellers of ancestors. I build with Laura Perez's work, where she articulates that the Chicana artists engage in curandera healer work, reclaiming and reformulating spiritual worldviews that are empowering them as women of color in order to reimagine possibilities of transformation through art. And what she articulates is something that I really gravitated towards, which is a more serious role for art, right? To see it as one that was actually articulating a political, spiritual viewpoint that was concerned for social justice and environmental responsibility. So I always see these artists, these writers, these creators as organic intellectuals, right? That perhaps haven't been trained in the institutions in these different ways, but that are really putting forward knowledge that really matters, right? And planting seeds in us as we're witnessing their art. And while not everyone that I focused on fits into that formulation of queer indígenas or even sees themselves as Chicanas or a curandera, what I found was that all of their artwork was connected to spiritual work, right? And really putting that forward. So what I started to see was the importance of putting forward this concept of creativity as spirit work, right? To really build another narrative. And that this then became a pathway for unraveling some of those decolonial knowledges to really start to see themselves as storytellers that allowed them to speak about the cosmic realm, about creating artwork, and really seeing their work as medicine. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you now around creativity as spirit work. And so this is really sort of a key concept that I meditated on. And again, I had a lot of trepidation when I was putting the language together, because what does it mean to do this work? But what I started to see is that we're all creators, right? We all have something that really is loud within us that wants to be said, that wants to be articulated, and that really when we tap in, we're able to do the work of expressing ourselves. And in this creativity as spirit work, these artists doing this work, we're really doing the work to remember teachings of their own elders, of their own ancestors, of things that they had, lessons that they had picked up, things that they had shared, right? And I started to see that this was Also, part of an intergenerational healing and connection with the healing of the earth. So central questions that drive this methodology: how is knowledge produced, and what and whose knowledge counts as evidence? And of course, here through my training, I was trained with Foucault, thinking through Foucault how knowledge is produced, and I started to think, well, why does only certain people's knowledge get counted, right? And does someone really have to go to be trained institution or be of a certain gender, etc., sexuality, to be able to articulate a truth, right? And so that was sort of at the core of kind of putting the mic to these artists and asking them to be philosophers, right? To speak their truths and to put that into the world. And so it really became, so which sites become a part of social memory, right? What gets recorded in our histories? What is erased? And how can this decolonial feminist methodology open the boundaries of disciplinary theoretical approach? So this is the first artist that I want to share with you about. This is Dalila Paola Mendez, who was just here for the Indigenous Borderland exhibition at Centro Cultural de la Raza. And this is some of her work with the Love Warrior here, which is a jaguar. And she is somebody who is of Central American descent. She identifies as a queer Indígena. And I'm just going to flip through some of her artwork so you can see it, but really also see sort of how she is somebody who really works through this creativity of spirit work, right? And brings that together. This is a piece that I speak about in the book, the Palam Huipil remix, a serigraph. It's her first serigraph, and it's intentionally looks like a weaving. She made a huipil, right? A top. And if you we could spend a lot of time analyzing this piece if you just start to look at it, right? You see the images and what she moves through to critique social transformation, and also what she's honoring as the symbols that really bring us peace and harmony. This, of course, is the cover of the book, or part of it. It doesn't show the lotus flower or the moons down here. But this is a piece called Diosas Enamoradas that she first did in 2005, and then she redid Diosas Enamoradas 2 is the one that is on the cover of the book in 2017. And this one is one that I write about in the book as well, where she did the work to sit with, in her Mayan cosmology, Kukulkan, who is featured here and is usually represented as a male. In the Mexicayo tradition, we would equate Kukulkan with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. And what she did was she basically changed the gender of Kukulkan and made them female, and a diosa. And so really doing the work to think through trans communities, but also identities through our ancestors. And she really spoke about how, as a queer Indígena artist, when we think about sort of what's on our temples, what's in our ancient structures, we don't find those queer histories. So this was part of her movement or energy to create that and to find that, and really entering into her world to find that. And this one, yes, so beautiful. Queerios, love your heart so you can be who you are. Fabulousness guaranteed, right? And so this is a playful one that she did, also a serigraph. She works a lot out of self-help graphics in Los Angeles, and has also been selected to go to Cuba to do work over there with artists. This is a very beautiful one called LA Reimagined, that you can see sort of her rethinking, really building from her Salvadorian roots and the way that they think through or create art there. And you could see she's also a master gardener. So we could see how she moves through creating the gardens and the homes, and really sees LA in another way, right? And peace and love there is featured on the top. And this is the final one that I'll share with you of Dalila. This is another huipil, another top, and this is really more, actually there's two, this one and one more I'll show you. This is really thinking through biodynamics and healing, and sort of a rethinking of how we're working with the earth and what we're creating. She's also featuring detention centers here, and thinking about the recent sort of removal of children, forced removal of children, also thinking about street vendors. So really bringing different communities together. And finally, Corazón del Aire, that features the Quetzal bird there, as well as the woman's torso and the volcanic lands that are part of the landscape in El Salvador. This one was also featured in the recent exhibition at Indigenous Borderlands, and she actually did the 4 elements. So she did wind, earth, fire, and wind, earth, fire, land. Water, thank you. And that always happens when I try to say out more. And she really used that as a way to rethink her own traumas with sexual violence, as a way to focus on the body that wasn't objectified, but instead beautified. The other artist that I focus on in that chapter is Gina Aparicio. And this is an image of her in 2005. She is a sculptor, and she does this work here to create, or this is the start of her creating in the spirit of the ancestors, a clay structure. And what she really articulates is that usually when we see sort of goddesses or diosas, they're unclothed, they don't look like us walking around. And she really wanted to create an urban representation and also an altar here. So when I first witnessed this piece, I saw a little child that was about 2 or 3 around it. And then a young elder that came around to show her all of the elements based on this altar. So they become also teaching moments and ways to bring in the young children to show them about our traditions. This is Cuica Mashquitia, and she who sings to be free. And as you can see, she's pregnant with the earth. She's Indígena, and really a critique here on forms of religion. Here we have Caught Between Worlds, Praying for a Better Future. This is the one that was featured at the Shrem, but she created it as her master's in Florida. And I'll just sort of move through these, but you're gonna see 4 Mesoamerican nahuales, a deer, a bear, a jaguar, and an owl. Each of them with an instrument ready for ceremony, one with a chanupa, ready to smoke. And in the center, we see an image of Coyoshauqui, the Aztec moon energy, and really thinking through ceremony. And in this one, we also had music playing in the background. This is Gina herself. This is at the entrance of the exhibition, where she's starting to create a place for the tobacco ties. And here we have the prayers that she asked people to put forward for a prayer for social justice. And I just wanted to show you the closer images that just happened at the exhibition here on Kumeyaay land at the Centro Cultural de la Raza. Here we have the bear and the jaguar. And you can see that here we did the work to feature this jaguar next to Dalila's Wipil, the Balam Wipil seriograph. So we put the jaguars in conversation. So for sake of time and also to open up questions, I'm just gonna kind of share with you chapter 4, which is around tracing Latina, lesbiana historias. And this one really does the work then to go take a different kind of step. Instead of thinking about the artwork, here I think more about the archives and how these elders, similar to the revered elders that we have in the audience, have done the work to really preserve knowledge and to create a space for us to understand that cultural knowledge. Here I focus on Laura Aguilar, Gloria Anzaldúa, Jean Cordovar, Sherry Moraga, Juanita Ramos, Yolanda Redder, Tatiana La Tierra, and Carla Trujillo. I got to interview all of them except Sherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa, who I just sat down with informally. But the other ones I was able to do oral histories with and think through their cultural productions over time. In this chapter, I really go into thinking about how anthologies become a site of us really documenting ourselves and really putting that energy forward where we'll be remembered, right? I started to see how this started to create knowledge that could be then guarded and that could guide us through generations. Oftentimes, the anthology is seen as something that is not really valued, but what I started to see was the importance of even the forwards or the introductions, right, of those really being like these sites of putting down politics. For example, this bridge called My Back really thinking about what does it mean to walk that radical way, right? And from that, we start to see a solidarity being created and intervened in spaces of academia. And so the one that I really want to highlight for you today is on Yolanda Redder. And this is an image by Laura Aguilar, who was a photographer and is now in the spirit world. It was taken in 1987, and it was part of a Latina lesbian series. It was the first photograph that Laura Aguilar took of this Latina lesbian series. And so when I first started this research, not as an undergrad, but already as a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz, I went to go visit Yolanda Redder at UCLA. And I sat down with her and I asked her to help me think about how do I start collecting these oral histories and start working with these knowledges of our elders. And so little did I know that this was gonna come full circle the way that it did. But in that time, what I did was I started to interview Laura Aguilar. I started to interview different people. And one of the things that she really talked to me about was when you go sit down with someone and share with someone, see it as a conversation. Don't see it as you're there to like get knowledge or extract something, but instead just connect with them. What do they want to share? What is something that is on their mind that they want to open up? And from there, the conversation went on. And I'll just fast forward to, to the end of it so we can start our conversation collectively, which is that, well, I will share that Yolanda Redder is a Latina dyke of Peruvian ancestry, and she actually submitted to or responded to the call for this bridge called My Back with her information and biographical sketch because she wanted to be part of that network. She actually interviewed Juanita Ramos, who wrote Compañeras, Latina Lesbians, which is another early anthology around Latina lesbianas. And she really did the work to intentionally name herself a lesbian, right? So again, for me, I was this young person just trying to find myself, and I'm starting to find these remnants. What I will share about Yolanda Redder is that as I moved through and started to learn more about Laura Aguilar's full series of Latina lesbian series, as well as her work on documenting small bars in Los Angeles, lesbian bars, is that I started to see that there was not a lot of recognition around this. And one of the important parts was that Laura Aguilar would include their voices into this. And so for Yolanda Redder, she really talked about how, let me see, when her photo was taken, she was, okay, I'm trying to find that little part. She was spoken about how she looked upset. And she said, do I really look upset here or am I just sort of representing myself? And I'll take it to the close here by oh, this is where it is, sorry. I'm gonna read this part to you. She said, my Latina side infuses my lesbian side with chispa y pasión. I am a lifelong lesbian, and I think that women hold powerful promise for changing conditions on the planet. You think I look hostile? Maybe it has to do with the passion for and impatience with the vision. Maybe it comes from comparing what could be with what is. Y qué, right? So that's Yolanda Redder. And when I learned that she transitioned unexpectedly in 2007, I took myself back to the UCLA archives to see what she had collected, because she had done a lot of work also to collect oral histories. And I found a tape that said Chicana lesbians, 1960s, 1970s. And I got super excited because I was like, this is exactly what I've been searching for. And she has it as part of the archive. So I put it in, I pushed play, and I was super shocked because it was my voice and her voice in conversation. And in that moment, right, the chills, all the things, I understood that then I had a responsibility, that I couldn't stop my research no matter what anybody said, that I had to put it down on paper and make sure that whatever stories were offered to me and gifted to me then had to become part of the documentation that I offered. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susie, so much. We're gonna open the floor for questions, compliments, constructive critiques, comments. And we have a book to raffle, so as an extra incentive, if compliment, comment, question, we'll write your name down, and at the end, someone is gonna win a book that Susie maybe will sign for you. Yes. So the floor is open. Yes.
Well, no one's saying it, but that was so a lot. You seem very accomplished, and it was really beautiful to share all your accomplishments and all the people you've worked with. Like I said,
Thank you. I know, I always worry that it's gonna be too much, and when I'm working on it, I'm like, pare it down, slow it down. But it's also, it does feel like a responsibility, like even each image, right? We could spend so much time with each one, and then each image is connected to these beautiful artists that have these visions, right? And I think it's just so urgent, right? Similar to the theme of the colloquium, to really think through what it means to have this time to be able to put our hands in the earth and really pay attention to what we're experiencing. And then to heed the lessons of our elders, right? To understand that what they've lived is so important and what they witnessed and those spaces that they opened up for us. Because I don't even think I would have a job or even a presentation or a book if it wasn't for all that blood, sweat, and tears that came before me, right? And so it's also a vow to that. So thank you.
So a question online.
Okay.
I'll read it. It's from Iris Lopez.
Mhm.
What piece of advice would you give yourself as a grad student? What was crucial to honoring yourself in these academic spaces?
That's a great question. I love that question. So the piece of advice that I would give my grad student self is to learn how to trust myself and to build practices around that. So for example, I started to practice Tai Chi. I started to connect with the ocean, and I also started jogging at that time. And eating much better, right? Because there was no drive-throughs in Santa Cruz. Like, you know, so I had to cook myself. So those kinds of practices of, just really taking care of oneself, I think are super important. And also to develop a practice of protection, right? So that if you are walking into a classroom space, perhaps with somebody who has different agenda or ideas from you, that if someone says something to you that could be hurtful or may not respect the ideas that you hold, that you don't take it to heart, right? So I had to learn how to also protect my heart and protect myself. And not that I wasn't open to critique, but to see it as that, as critique and not as I have failed or I am done, right? And I think also with that, just because it's such a powerful question, I think it's also staying in tune with your core and trusting your assignment, right? What are you here to do? And it might not look like your professors, the person next to you, right? But to really trust the downloads that you're receiving.
What types of pushback did you receive while creating your arts?
So much. That's like a 3-hour conversation before, maybe a week. But I received a lot of pushback. I mean, I got asked, are you on drugs? I got asked when I first started doing this work, I had shaved my head. I was just in a different place. And so a lot of people had questions about what I was doing. It was thinking about spirituality, writing about spirituality, there was pushback there, but also even focusing on lesbians, dykes, right? There was this is not real knowledge, why are you documenting this? To then thinking about Gloria Saldúa, is she actually, an Indígena, right? Is she actually indigenous? There were so many things to reckon with along the way. And then in my own journey, I think I actually got this really prestigious National Science Foundation fellowship in my first year, a $90,000 fellowship. My mom was like, print it out so they don't take it away from her. But literally after that, I lost my voice. I couldn't speak. So it was almost like this feeling of that I would walk into a classroom and they would be like, why did she get that? You know, so it was almost like that too, like I was not deserving. So it was a lot of like fighting around who I was and all my identity. So that was the other part, is that I didn't only show up in one way. I'm always been a very complicated being, you know? And so there was a lot of pushback around that, from the way I looked to how I sounded to what I received, just all of it. So what I decided, not decided, but what I entered into was, you know what? That's when I found Koyo Shauki, who was in the center of Gina Aparicio's piece. And this is an image that is about the moon, right? That's her energy. And I started to understand that the moon always shifts and is in fragments. And sometimes she's in her shadows, in the darkness. And sometimes she's super bright and glowing and even has a rainbow around it, right? And I decided that, you know what, that's how I am. Right? I'm super complicated. I have a lot going on, but I'm always there. I'm always good. And so that's what I started to come home to in the midst of receiving all of that. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, 1, 2, 3.
I wanted to ask, like, while you were in grad school, did you ever feel like there was like pressure for like queer people to like kind of like remain closeted or like not bring it up? And like, if so, how did you like deal with like kind of like that like homophobic environment?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And you know, and it makes me sad that we have to think about that, but that's super real. You know, again, it was this idea that that lesbian studies, that queer studies were not a worthy site of knowledge. That's where it started, right? And also the minute that you started to articulate that, it was almost like, oh, this person is just doing those identity politics, right? Very dismissive. Like that's not real theoretical, you know, producing knowledge work, right? I was like, who do you think Foucault was? You know, just kind of step back. But so but I think that in terms of walking in that way, it sometimes did feel dangerous. You know, so what I had to do was to find people who were either queer themselves or create those spaces. So I did end up starting a Queer Latina network on my campus that was undergrad, grad, staff, and faculty. And we would just meet and, you know, sometimes, you know, just have food, share food, but I started to sort of create those spaces. We also had a Women of Color research cluster. And that was another space where we started to do like film festivals. And what we would do is we would bring in the queer community. So maybe we weren't like protesting the homophobia, but we were showing the visibility of we're here and we're doing great, we're doing well, and we're gonna keep being here, right? So that was how we sort of dealt with that.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
In your presentation, you talked about importance of seeing your experiences talking to other people as conversations instead of like interrogations or
Yes.
interviews. So I was wondering what informed your ability to feel more on an equal standing with those people, especially, you know, in that struggle to kind of find or understand yourself.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because right, you're struggling with like, why am I even worthy to sit down with you in the conversation? But then you're also like this researcher and you're coming from an institution. So it's all those things colliding. And I think what I started to do was, this may sound funny, but what I started to do was just practice in the mirror, right? Like to just humble myself and say, you know what, like one, I'm worthy, but also I'm human. And so I might make mistakes, but I'm also ready to have these conversations. And really that's when I started to tap into my own fire around, this is my passion. Like I wanna listen because I genuinely wanna learn. And it's not about me going to extract, it took me so long to write my dissertation because I was worried that it would be seen as extraction. And I kept going back to the artists and being like, are you sure I can write about your work? And they were like, yes, right? And I was like, you know, but it was this energy. So I finally had to be like, okay, the only one standing in your way is you. That's the only person standing in your way. So, and maybe my community members a little bit, but that's their job, right? So it was more of like, I had to authorize myself to say, I'm gonna do this in a good way. And how do I assure that? Well, I assure that I'm not extracting, that I'm actually receiving and receiving it as an offering. And so to really humble myself and then also simultaneously feel honored that people were willing to sit with me and to really see it as Yolanda Ritter was so good because she was kind of intense, you know, but she was just like, it's a conversation. And when she told me, she was said, people are gonna start leaving this earth, so you need to do that work, right? Like, don't be in your ego about it, right? Get on it, do your work. And so that was like, oh, okay, I better get on it, right? And I'm grateful because that put me into find a recorder, figure out how to do it. And if they don't want to be recorded, you take your notes, whatever they want, right? And create an environment for them. And then always be reciprocal, always give an offering. I think there was another question, yes.
What advice would you give to like a young person struggling to connect with their culture or ancestry?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. One thing that was offered to me, and I offer this really humbly, is to build a site of connection in your space, right? So the first thing that I had to do, and this actually came from my friend Pablo, was to find just like a table, wipe it down, put a candle, put some water, and then just start to create like a little altar. And in that, just start to create a conversation with your inner world, inner work. And what was encouraged was to put a picture, right, an image of yourself, you're joyful, and then to start to bring in things of your own family. And it's really a remembering, right? What's there in my family? Some of us are adopted into our families. Some of us don't know our family history. So every journey is going to be different. That's what I would recommend on the inner work, like in your home. And then beyond that, I would say to start looking for it. Like take the, women's studies, Chicana studies courses, the Caribbean studies courses, right? Indigenous studies courses. Take those courses where you can start to find people practices, right? And also ask yourself, right? If we were going to go there, maybe like the 2.0 is to start talking to them, right? Like to just start asking questions. Once you start building your altar, start asking them questions, right? Wherever you feel comfortable, whether it's at the ocean, whether it's with the sun, right? But to really create quiet spaces for yourself to start to connect. And then also connecting with community spaces, simultaneously. I hope that helps.
We have a question here, another on Zoom, and
then there was the person. Okay. Yes.
First off, I wanted to say thank you so much for your work as a queer Latina in this language, that you are spreading this knowledge that we don't really ever get. This knowledge that I've never been given. So I want to say thank you. And my question is, what was your family's response to your work? Because I know that with culture, with Mexican culture, there's certain politics, so I'm just curious to know what the response was.
Yes, I'm like, okay, you have tissue? No, just kidding. So my family, I thank you for your comment, first of all. And I think in terms of my family, I'm going to speak about my mom. My sisters were very, supportive. And my younger sister was especially supportive. And she's 10 years younger than me. And when I was 21, I actually got asked to leave my house because I was queer. And not asked to leave, right? I had to leave my house. And that was my mom, right? And she was a single mama. She didn't know how to handle it. And I knew she loved me, but at that moment, she was like, you have to go. And I was in Catholic school for 12 years. And she was like, how did my children turn out like this, right? So she just had all these things to say about that. But, and then she told me, because she walks the Catholic faith, she told me, if you ever share with anyone else in our family, that would be the worst betrayal, right? And so there was so much sadness, so much deep sadness. And for me, I was over there, anti-police brutality, free Mumia, right? Connecting with Communist Party, So she didn't know any of that, right? So I was queer, but I was also all these other things. And so what I did with that was I put it into my research. I put it into my work, and I took care of myself that way. At that time, I also had a partner, and when she kicked me out, she said, you can no longer bring that person around here, right? And so it was just very traumatic in a lot of ways. And to respond to her, you can't tell anyone else in our family, and this is why I get my book, because I wrote And I put it out there, and now it's everywhere, right? It's on my social media, my family knows. And I think the way that they deal with it is, I even put their names on it and I dedicated it to my grandmas, right? Because they taught me that it's important to remember. And I think for me, I don't want to lose myself to not knowing who I am. So I'd rather do that and know that it's putting myself and my life on the line, but also I'm so privileged, to be able to even say it out loud. Because there's a lot of people who can't say it. And there's a lot of, young children, right, who actually take their lives because they feel so much in danger, right? So I'm like, if I can say it and if I can teach about it and I can write about it, then I'm gonna do it. And you know what, at the end of the day, my mom loves me so much and my family loves me so much, even if they can't fully understand everything I'm doing or even fully bring it in. Okay? Thank you. Okay, I'll try to be faster. Sorry.
You're good, you're good.
Only 12:10. We have an online question.
Okay, perfect.
So, hi, I wanted to ask, how was the journey with reconnecting to your Indigenous roots, and would you recommend it?
I definitely recommend it. I think it's the most amazing thing that has ever happened to me besides coming out, right? It's like another entering into myself. And I think the way that happened for me was very necessary because it was the pathway to me understanding who I was on this earth and also the sacred path that I'm supposed to be walking. And actually through Catholic school, I actually didn't like to pray because I didn't like the idea that I had to talk, no offense, that I had to talk to a man to be able to connect with something divine, right? I was like, what is that? And that's not who I am. And so for me, walking and reclaiming and re-indigenizing myself, I then started to feel what I felt when I was younger, which is I'm super connected to the land. And these plants are communicating with me. And I am connecting with with a creator, right? And so I definitely recommend it. and definitely recommend it in a way where we're not appropriating other people's cultures, but we're doing the work to understand our own connection. Okay. And then you were directing us. Yes.
I just want to first thank you so much. This was beautiful. And also I really liked the beginning when you were talking about them remembering and talking about your grandmother. It made me think of my grandmother because she also has Alzheimer's. And I used to be able to talk to her about a couple things and now it's here and there. So just thank you. And I also want to know how your transition was from getting your master's to PhD school and what that was like for you.
Yes, that's beautiful. And actually what's interesting is that I went to a graduate program that I got my master's en route to getting my PhD. So it was part of it. But because, back to your question of the backlash, when I was applying to graduate school, I actually got told by one of my mentors at that time that I wasn't cut out to get a PhD, so that I should only apply to master's programs. And so, I, just like everything else, I listened and I just kind of sat with it and I said, okay, I'll apply to master's, but I'm still gonna go ahead and apply to PhD programs, see what happens, right? And so I actually was about to apply to this program here because I thought it was super amazing. But in that I had already I applied to UCLA, UCLA was the first acceptance. I applied to their master's program in women's studies and I got a phone call being accepted to their PhD program and I was like, okay. So I think for me, it was that careful walk of understanding. The reason why I did that is because I taught 5th grade for 3 years. So I had been in school getting my teaching credential. I went from undergrad to getting my teaching credential for 3 years. And I was like, okay, PhD is gonna be about 6 to 8 years, is what I imagine. So I was like, if I'm gonna do it, I better just go because I might otherwise not. But I did intentionally get the master's in sociology and then the PhD. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
And then my friend Pablo, I'll just share this really quick. We were both in McNair Scholars at Cal State Long Beach, and so he first went and he got his master's at CSUN, and then he went in Cal State Northridge.
And then he went and got his PhD at Claremont Graduate College. And for him, what I admired about that journey was that by the time he got into his PhD program, he knew who he was. He wasn't questioning, he wasn't worried, because he was older, right? And so for me, I was still kind of young when I entered the PhD, so that was kind of tough. So I think for everyone, it's slightly different, right? Like, what route do you want to take? Financially, where are you? Do you have family? You know, all of the parts. And then he was like, I'm only staying in the LA area. I was more open to, moving. So it's, everyone's journey is slightly different in that way. Yeah. Okay. Yes, finally to you. Thank you for being patient.
No, thank you for your time. You brought up a good point on like antiquated cultural standards, like heteronormative cultural standards within the Chicanx or Latin, whatever backgrounds they come from.
Yes.
What advice would you give to people from a queer community that come from these backgrounds that aren't accepting, or families that aren't accepting, to be able to still hold on to their cultural significance? I would imagine some people would let go of that background because they're associating it to rejection.
Yes.
And then they lose that kind of cultural identity of where they came from. Unfortunately, like, where would you give that advice, that balance between?
I love that question, and I have to say that chapter 1 of the book, which I didn't talk about, is literally about how do we do the work to understand our relationship to the land, to open up a space for queerness, to understand that we have, even if it wasn't called queerness or being trans or being third gender, being lesbian, even if it wasn't called that, that's always been part of who we are. And one of the things that's really significant is that when the Spanish colonizers came, and excuse me if this is really intense, but when the Spanish colonizers came, the first people that they wanted to take out were the transgender people, right? That's who they set the dogs on. And so for me, then it becomes this energy of, this is exactly who we are. And we're so special and so important as people that they literally think we could take out a whole civilization, right? So for me, it's about that healing. It has to be about healing, because if I forget that I'm Chicana, that my family's from Mexico, then I'm forgetting a part of myself, right? And my spirit wants me to remember all of who I am and bring all of those complicated pieces together. So my advice would be to really understand that, even our own people sometimes have a hard time understanding who we are, but to have compassion, right? So I think that's where like Buddhist teachings really enter around, like, what does it mean to bow to that compassion? And while we're bringing up like the seeds of grief, to also bring up the seeds of love, to be able to hold us in those really hard moments, right? So like, and I know this is being recorded and all that, but I'm just gonna go there. So like, for example, even on my journey down, it was like a full moon, and I was sitting on my journey, and the first 2 hours of my drive, I just cried. And sometimes it's like that. Like, you don't really even know what you're crying about, or what you're angry about, or what you wanna like, explode about, but there's so much happening in our inner worlds, right? And sometimes it comes from like an ancestor that needs to release it. And sometimes it comes from an experience of feeling not seen or not heard, right? But it's really then about holding yourself through that, right? Loving yourself, being gentle, surrounding yourself with people who can see you, and then saying, okay, and now we take the next step and we're good because we just got through that, right? So like that shedding, like the snake sheds its skin, right? So thank you for the question. I hope that helps.
And first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was very beautiful, and I feel like I learned a lot. I noticed throughout the presentation, there's kind of a blend of different languages being represented and spoken. I was wondering what role you see languages like playing in your work.
Thank you for that question. I took out the slide that spoke about language because I was trying to save time. And so yes, so the book actually it's written mostly in English, has Spanish, and it has Nahuatl. And that was very intentional, building on our ancestor Gorean Saldua, but also when I started to write, that's what arrived, right? And so the publisher, was like, you need to take all that out. Get rid of that. And so what ended up happening is that I had to make a note for the reader at the front
to really sort of set the tone for all of the language, and to really then invite them to say, and I even said it in the beginning, right? Like the note to the reader, I'll just pass it to you. But like to really say, this is not about exclusion. This is not about not wanting everyone to understand. This is just about some words have to be said in a particular language in a particular way. And I think that's also me doing that work to say, like, language revitalization for Native tribes, for Indigenous tribes, for all peoples that have access to our native languages, we need to do that, right? And also to say, you know, kind of speak back to, what was it, proposition, what was it,
209, 187.
Yeah, the one that wanted to, the UNS initiative, that wanted to make.
And bilingualism?
Yes, and make English the global language, right? To speak back to those like propositions, right, that really want to say there's only one language, right? The other teaching that I have in my heart is, for example, the word tlasokamati, and I learned this from a teacher named Patricia Juarez, that, for example, tlasokamati is like, thank you, I feel it in my heart. Like really deep in there, right? Versus like gracias, which is in Spanish, versus thank you, right? So it's really like another layer of language and concept. So that could probably even have images to it. So for me, that was important to at least try to gesture to, you know, and that could have gone way deeper. Other people do a much better job than I did, but I think it's important as much as we can to reconnect back to that scene. Yeah, thank you for the language.
Also, thank you so much for.
Thank you for nodding the whole time. Right?
I do appreciate when you said like the talk about your own voice when you have wasn't like better at it so, and I can relate to like the concept of evidence course, like you try to find so hard like evidence that can hit you personally, because I'm like Vietnamese American, I was just like trying to find like evidence, but it turns out that evidence can be loaded, of course, in that.
Yes.
It's like less because when you have your own voice in there, it's actually super useful that it can be your part of your evidence actually, and having that voice out there. Because evidence can be like written document, but it's not limited actually. And then when I took this class with kind of Swami by me, it's like the car records and like what we swan. I was like, those are evidence, but what about like non-evidence words, like what were they words? So I do appreciate when you mention that actually, because I can relate to so many levels on that actually. So
thank you, and I felt your energy agreeing with me, so I appreciate that. And I also want to say that, you know, I'm grateful that you have these professors who are opening up these worlds to you, and you are all very fortunate, because anytime I look at this program, I'm so amazed, you know, of what you have here. And I know we have an alumni here also of the program. And I think what I want to say to that is that that was one of the main challenges that I received around evidence. Like, what is your evidence? You know, and I got held to that so much. And at some point, you know, I started to say, how do I talk about this? And we sort of spoke about this at the bookstore the other day, about a dream, right? Or about something I felt when I smelled smoke, right? How do I make that evidence? How do I talk about that? And so that's sort of why I had to start to turn to art and creativity, right? To give that a space, and then also plant medicine, because I started to understand there's something in that plant medicine, in these nopales, right? That are shaped like hearts, right? In the foods that my grandmother, that my mom, that my tias, my aunts are cooking, that I'm cooking, right? That I'm feeling. And so it really is an embodied experience, which a lot of times with evidence, it's all about the mind, right? The intellect. But really what we're saying, and what a lot of women of color feminists and other folks have done, is say it's actually our experiences in the body that also matter, right? So we matter, we all matter, right? So I love that. And it's like, yeah, and our experiences are also part of the evidence, right? So yes. Yes.
Thank you so much. This has been such a like incredible conversation with you, and I think you've done such a great job of honoring some of the Latina queer folks that have passed on to the next life too, and especially Lara Aguilar, who I've been like a really big fan of, and I think being in conversation with you has like been in conversation with her as well in a way. So I'm really grateful to be in that space. And so my question is, how can we like take what we've learned from this conversation and then also honor you in the way that you've honored your foremothers in a way? And how can us as like the next generation, how can we honor y'all that just have so much to offer?
That's a good question. I honestly feel like the best was, so someone said this to me, because I couldn't finish the book, right? I was like, no. So they're gonna see me. And I was like, don't let it happen. And then someone said to me, oh, you know what? This is just like a blueprint. This is just like little, something that you're offering. And then I said, okay, you know what? It's true. Like, get my ego out of the way. And I think the biggest form of reciprocity is for you to then do your work in the way that makes most sense to you. And I think for me, what I always tell my students is like, you don't have to agree with me. You don't have to see things through of course, we're not going to see everything the same, but it's more of, right, continuing to plant and water and cultivate the seeds that will nourish you and nourish community. And I think for me, at this point, I'm just like many of you in the room, and I'm sure on this campus, are so concerned with what's happening on our earth, with what's happening with Palestinian people, with what's happening in forms of genocide, with what's happening with Native folks, with what's happening with the children in detention centers, right? All of that. And with people in prisons. So, and that was kind of the prayer that we had, right? We kind of just did the work, what's happening with trans people, with youth, right? So I think though that we can get really overwhelmed. I get really overwhelmed, right? So then it's kind of like, how do I just do my part? Like what really speaks to my heart? How do I just really take care of that and honor that? And so then when I see my relative working on something right next to me, that I honor them and uplift them and give them the courage. Like if I'm walking in a courageous way, then they can walk in a courageous way as well to uplift what's important to them and their communities and all of what's around them. So I think just doing your work in the most powerful way, and then also doing that shadow work, like the part that we don't want to do, like I don't want to think about like how I'm a jealous person, sometimes I get competitive and, all the things that sometimes in the academy we also face, right? And it's tough, but it's like, okay, sit down in front of that mirror, right? And look at myself and say, well, what's going on? What's coming up for me? And then just acknowledge, well, I'm human too, right? And so then humble myself to that and then keep going in the best way, right? So kind of recycling that energy. I hope that's a good answer. Anyone want to add to that? Any elders in the room want to add to that?
Well, I mean, obviously, your work is an introduction for the next generation to take the next steps, right? So the baton is in their hands as well.
That's right. I love that. Yes. Thank you.
I added Harper and Lalo. I just know your name, so.
All right, let's see who wins the phone.
Your lucky day. I folded them all.
Okay. Should I hand it to you?
No, you were there.
Oh.
Jasmine Ibarra.
Oh. Yeah.
Full circle.
Full circle. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take a picture here and also to document this